take, say, Barack Obama. He's called the first black president. Why the first black president? Why isn't he just another white president? In fact, the concept white keeps changing. So, yes, there's a kind of a Cold War developing with China. The United States claims to be threatened by China, but where is this threat? And nobody can find it. The rich countries are, out of pure greed, are accepting the moral opprobrium, should be moral opprobrium of killing lots of people and also acting to harm themselves. Well, that says something about what kind of a species we are.
In the last approximately 3 decades, we have seen a plethora of theories trying to explain in one way or another the assumed relationship between the social construct known as race, biology, and language. Indeed, now there's a trend emerging dubbed racio-linguistics, focusing on how race can be constructed or deconstructed through the lens of language. What is your current opinion on these trends, and is there any at all scientific connection between race and language?
There's no. First of all, we have to distinguish between language and language use. There's an obvious connection between what's called race and the way people use language. So the Nazis used language so that race had a specific meaning, depending on how many generations back there was a Jewish ancestor. In the United States, up until the 1960s, there were definitions of race that were much more extreme. In fact, so extreme that the Nazis refused to borrow them. So the principle that in many of the southern states was called one drop of blood. So there were laws against miscegenation. And if you could show that one of the people had one drop of blood, however far back, that was black, then it was miscegenation and it was illegal. That was too much for the Nazis. There are other ways in which use of language involves race, but as for language itself, it says nothing. You can speak English and be a racist or an anti-racist. As far as the categories are concerned, it doesn't really make much sense to say that biology is a social construct. It's a science. With regard to language, again, depends whether you mean the language itself or the way it's used. The language itself is an organic object, like the visual system. The way language is used is, of course, involved in many factors. Race is a much more complex notion. It has no biological meaning. I mean, in what we call race, there are elements of biological background. There's many other elements. So take, say, Barack Obama. He's called the first black president. Why the first black president? Why isn't he just another white president? His mother was white, his father was black. So why is he a black president? That's use of racist use of language, ubiquitous. I mean, he uses it too. He actually had a DNA analysis, and they found that he had a slave ancestor on his white mother's side. His white mother had a slave ancestor. Well, that's the concept race. You can divide people up in many different ways. There's one, particularly since the Enlightenment and the colonial conquests, that's relied heavily on things like skin color. You could do it some other way. But there are, of course, biological elements in the way people use the concept race, but it's not a biological concept. In fact, the concept white keeps changing. You go back far enough, I wasn't white, because I'm Jewish, and Jews were not considered white. That changed. Take today, we're seeing a transition in which Hispanics are becoming white. They're the same biology. They're viewed differently. They view themselves differently. So race is a strange concept. It's a mixture of all sorts of things. Biology and language I think biology is just another science. Linguistics is like biology. Language use is, it's not a social construct, but it's, of course, deeply connected with social conditions, cultural, political conditions, and so on.
I see. So there's basically no way how someone's race is that there's no effect on a man's race on how they learn a language at all. Oh, yes, I will. I was just curious because when I was getting ready for this interview, I found one of your cultural engagements from 1972 with Richard Hurstein about his book, The Bell Curve, which was saying social inequality is a result of inherited variations in the IQ. You debunked this theory, saying that there's no basically there's no connection between inherited variations as IQ and social inequality. This is the closest I find when you were talking about race and linguistics, when it was about IQ. But I think, Professor, thank you, I pretty much understand that in your concept of language and linguistics, there's no such thing as race.
Let's start with the notion cancel culture.
Yes, sir.
The recent notion, it's an interesting one, perfect example of a social construct for as far back as you can trace. There was repression in the universities, in the academic profession, in the media, and so on, which barred people from appearance. But it was directed against the left, so nobody cared about it. Could give you plenty of examples from my own experience, which would be considered horrifying and indescribable if the person concerned were in the mainstream or on the right. The new concept of cancel culture has to do with the fact that some elements, mostly young people in student bodies, are adopting the techniques that have been standard to repress the left. And as I said before, I think it's totally wrong in principle and tactically idiotic. It's a gift to the right wing, but it's completely wrong in principle, as it has always been. That's what's called cancel culture. Now, as far as the social media are concerned, I'm not really the best person to ask. I don't use social media. I only know about them secondhand. And from the experience I have with people who use them and the fairly extensive literature concerning them, there does seem to be a tendency that one can identify. In principle, social media could be used and maybe to some extent are used as a mode of interaction, bringing people together, setting up a community of civilized discourse about crucial issues and so on. That could be done. It seems that that's not what is being done, at least the major part. The social media seem to be driving people into self-reinforcing bubbles in which they essentially hear more or less their own opinions echoed, amplified, modified, and you end up with groups that are not speaking to each other and don't understand one another, and often are highly antagonistic to one another. In the United States, that's become extreme. You know, the very interesting phenomenon in the United States, the last 10 or 20 years, the concept Republican and Democrat have shifted from what they used to be. They used to be party affiliations. One could easily shift from one to the other. I've voted for Republicans in the past, and that's changed. Now the two parties, especially the Republican Party, are basically religious cults. You belong to them, you hate everybody else. Okay, extremist religious cults. That's particularly true of the Republicans, who've essentially departed from normal parliamentary politics. Now, this is a matter, not just my opinion. You can read discussions about this in the most sober mainstream journals. Take a look at the London Financial Times, the world's major business journal. Sober, not given to exaggeration. The major columnists, highly regarded columnists, are issuing warnings that the United States might collapse into autocracy, abandoning democracy in anything but form, because of one party that has become a radical party with an authoritarian agenda, rather similar to the far-right parties in Europe with neo-fascist origins. That's a very severe threat to the country and indeed to the world because of US power. Well, I think social media have contributed to that. I don't know if it's possible to demonstrate it, but the evidence seems to be there by separating people into self-reinforcing chambers of common opinion and dismissal of others without understanding. It's a real, the effects are very serious.
You started your career when the Cold War was a reality. After the most recent withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan, rumors are already circulating in the EU that the United States might abandon Europe as America is shifting its focus towards Asia. Is a new Cold War emerging? If so, in what way will it be different from the last one?
So the Cold War, first of all, the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan is the delayed result of an enterprise that never should have been undertaken in the first place. If you go back to 2001, the Bush administration had no justification for invading Afghanistan. And indeed, they made it very clear that their concern was not Afghanistan, not Al-Qaeda, not bin Laden. That was explicit. So, for example, when the US attacked very quickly the Taliban returned to their villages, and the leadership offered total surrender. The US reaction was, I'm quoting, "We do not negotiate surrenders." Okay, a surrender would have meant handing bin Laden and Al-Qaeda over to the United States, but we do not negotiate surrenders. In fact, both President Bush and Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, made it very clear that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden was not seriously their concern. They had bigger game in mind. They wanted to conquer Iraq, that's a real prize, expand over the Middle East, major enterprises. If they had been interested in Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, first of all, they could have accepted the extradition offers, or a small police operation would have sufficed, probably with the cooperation of the Taliban, who wanted to get rid of Al-Qaeda, and bin Laden, who were just an impediment to them. They couldn't just throw them out for reasons of tribal culture, but they presumably would have cooperated. That was never tried. We do not negotiate surrenders. So what was the reason for the US attack? Had no strategic reason. The US has no interest in Afghanistan. It was a waste. The only plausible explanation I've heard for the invasion was given by Abdul Haq, the leading figure of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance, highly respected leader. He was interviewed right at the time of the invasion by Anatol Yevin, highly respected scholar of Central Asia. And he asked him, why did the United States invade? Abdul Haq said, they're going to kill a lot of Afghans. They're going to undermine our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, which are promising efforts. But the Americans don't care about that. They want to show their muscle and intimidate everyone in the world, which is probably accurate, fits with all of the data that we had. So now they withdrew after having found that their muscle didn't work very well. But they're not pulling out of the region. There's no indication of that. US is all over the Middle East. There are conflicts over Central Asia, but it's not about Afghanistan. It's a conflict with China. China, while the United States has been showing its muscle and intimidating everyone, China has been quietly integrating Central Asia into a Chinese-dominated Eurasian system. Includes the Central Asian states, includes India and Pakistan, includes Iran, includes Russia, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the United States requested not membership, but observer status. That was rejected. Now there's U.S. is being pushed out of its former bases in Central Asia as the countries are lining up with China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. That's the major conflict. But the U.S. is certainly not pulling out of the region. In fact, expanding the conflict with Iran is a central part of U.S. policy. Certainly was for Trump. Biden's essentially taken it over. I don't think that, I think with regard to the EU, the United States is indeed demonstrating its essential contempt for the European Union. We just saw that dramatically a few days ago. The United States made an agreement with Australia. Britain joined, but it's kind of an accessory, to sell to Australia a fleet of 8 highly advanced nuclear submarines that sharply intensifies. It's a highly provocative act which intensifies potential conflicts with China. Of course, it's telling China you have to build up your military resources to counter this threat. It's a very severe threat to China. But also the United States just totally dismissed Europe. What the deal abrogated an agreement between France and Australia for French submarines, conventional submarines, something which was very important for French military industry and also for France's role, which it has as a Pacific power. That Biden didn't even bother to inform France of it, just told France about it when it was over. Well, that's telling the European Union very clearly, here's where you stand in the world order that we will dominate. Same with Iran. When the United States, under Trump, tore up the joint agreement on nuclear programs, which was working very effectively, it also imposed harsh sanctions on Iran. Europe didn't want to go along with those. It objected to them strenuously. But Europe had to comply. The United States essentially informed Europe, either you observe our sanctions or you get thrown out of the international financial system, which is run from New York. So Europe complied. Europe observes the Iran sanctions. In fact, the whole world complies with US sanctions. US is the only country that can impose serious sanctions. Nobody else has the power to do that. The United States has very harsh sanctions, which amount essentially to a blockade against Cuba. That's 60 years now. The world is totally opposed to this. It was revealed once again at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago. They have an annual vote on the US blockade of Cuba. The vote was 184 to 2. The only country that would vote with the United States is Israel, which is essentially a client state. It has to do what the US orders. That's essentially total opposition, but everyone observes the sanctions, because if you don't, the United States can impose harsh penalties on you. Okay, that's world order. US is by no means retreating from its insistence on being global hegemon. In fact, that's the sole purpose of the nuclear submarine deal. It has no strategic purpose. These submarines won't even be in operation for probably 15 years. By that time, China will, of course, have expanded its military resources to counter the enormous threat of nuclear submarines. China has nothing remotely comparable, even if in its own territorial waters. So this is a way to ensure that China builds up its military, and when the nuclear submarines become operative, they'll be neutralized. So why do it? Why kick Europe in the face? Why sell advanced submarines, which Australia pays for, but then they're put under the US Naval Command? Only one reason: to show your muscle and intimidate everyone, to make it very clear that the US insists on remaining the hegemonic global power, using the threat of force and violence if necessary. So, yes, there's a kind of a Cold War developing with China. The United States claims to be threatened by China. But where is this threat? And nobody can find it. The threat is not in the Caribbean. It's not off the coast of California. The threat is off the coast of China. And if we look closely, I don't know if you want to go into it, but it's a very interesting story. The United States claims to be protecting the right of freedom of navigation when it sends naval armadas into the Chinese, what's called exclusive economic zone. That's 200 miles offshore. Countries have exclusive economic zones. The United States, this is part of the law of the sea. The United States is the only maritime power that has not even ratified the law of the sea. But the US insists that China obey Washington's interpretation of the law of the sea. The law of the sea says within the exclusive zones, there can be no threat or use of force. Well, the United States interprets that as meaning that the US is committed to carry out military and intelligence operations within the economic zone. China rejects that. They say freedom of navigation is fine, no problem, but no military and intelligence operations. China is joined, incidentally, by India. The United States Navy just carried out military intelligence operations in India's economic zone. India vigorously protested. The US insisted that it has a right to do so. Well, there's nothing at stake other than showing your muscle and intimidating everyone. So yes, this is certainly an area where diplomacy and negotiations are in order, but the United States would prefer to use a show of force. And China's doing ugly things as well, I should say. So Chinese planes have just intruded severely into Taiwanese military planes, intruded into Taiwanese airspace just yesterday, in fact. That's also provocative and dangerous. So there are tensions developing along the China coast. China itself is ringed with nuclear-armed missiles in the many U.S. bases off the eastern coast of China. U.S. has 800 military bases around the world. China has one in Djibouti, Africa. But we don't consider that China is under threat. We're under threat, even though the threat is undetectable. Well, that is a Cold War developing. Europe is sidelined as the brazen insult to France just demonstrated. But the US is not pulling out of the Middle East. It may be pushed out of Central Asia, but it's not pulling out. Yeah, these conflicts are worldwide, but the most dangerous areas are basically off the coast of China. A conflict between China and the United States is literally unthinkable. It would be so devastating everywhere that it's hard to know if organized human life could even survive it. It's an unthinkable conflict. And there are paths towards negotiation and diplomacy. Actually, that was true of the first Cold War as well. So take a couple of incidents. In 1952, Stalin made a pretty remarkable offer. He offered to allow Germany to be reunited. Some talk about potential elections, which of course the communists would lose, one condition, that a reunited Germany not join a hostile military alliance. Well, considering recent history, that was hardly unreasonable. Germany alone had virtually destroyed Russia twice in the past generation. So he was calling for no hostile military alliance, but unification of Germany. That would have probably ended the Cold War. US reaction, flat rejection. In fact, it wasn't even, US even kept it secret for a month so they could pass a huge military budget fund. The one US strategic analyst, highly respected one, James Warburg, he wrote about it. He said, we should consider this. He was simply ridiculed and ignored. Anyone else who mentioned it was also dismissed and ignored. Well, later the Russian archives came out in recent years. Take a look at US scholarship on the Cold War. They're saying, sounds as if it was real. Even Lavrenti Beria, KGB chief, was discussing the possibility of neutralization and ending the Cold War. US wasn't having any, wanted the Cold War to go on. There are many such incidents. It's not that China and Russia are blameless. Of course, they're not. Lots of criticisms you can make. But as far as escalating the international conflicts are concerned, I think the record shows that it's primarily the United States, essentially for Abdu'l-Haq's reasons. The United States itself has remarkable security, probably nothing like it in history. But if you're a hegemonic global power, you're in danger everywhere, just like Britain before it. So yes, there is a very serious threat of a conflict developing, which could be extremely dangerous for the world with China.
The Islamic State controlled territories as big as Great Britain between 2014 and 2018, with a thankfully sharp decline in the last few years. Now, with the US pulling out of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, how do you see the long-term effects of this on Muslim societies? Would it change the course of collective discourse on minorities from these regions?
What about the collective? First of all, as I suggested, I don't think the US is pulling out at all.
Yes.
It's staying there, just in a different form. The conflict with Iran, not the Middle East, is a clear example. The US policy in the Middle East was laid out very clearly by the Trump administration, and it's taken over by Biden. The idea doesn't simply involve the Middle East. It's to construct an alliance of many of the world's most reactionary states, centered in Washington. In the Western Hemisphere includes Bolsonaro's Brazil, proto-fascist government, includes India under Modi, who's dismantling Indian democracy and turning India into a highly autocratic ethnocracy, Hindu ethnocracy. So Modi is, of course, a natural member. In Europe, the chief member is Orban. This is the darling of the Republican Party. His so-called illiberal democracy is the model, so he's part of it. In the Middle East, it's the most reactionary states. The Gulf monarchies, which are among the harshest, most brutal states in the world. They have all the oil, of course. Includes Egypt under the worst dictatorship of Egypt's history. Includes Morocco, family dictatorship, which is important because Morocco has a near monopoly of phosphates, irreplaceable for agricultural purposes. Trump, in fact, authorized the Moroccan conquest of Western Sahara in violation of international law so that Morocco could extend its control over phosphates, which Western Sahara has. This is all welded together. The so-called Abraham Accords brought together the reactionary Arab states and Israel. That they had relations already, but this raised them to formal relations. Israel, which has moved very far to the right in recent years, is a natural member. It provides the technology, the military force, the security base, and so on. So all of that put together, this reactionary alliance does include the Middle East as a central component. And the US is certainly not pulling out of that. As far as minorities are concerned, they're victims. Palestinians, obviously. The Trump administration, now taken over by Biden, has essentially told the Palestinians, you have no rights. Israel was given everything it wanted. Can take over the Golan Heights in violation of Security Council orders, take over vastly expanded Jerusalem in violation of Security Council orders and World Court judgment, can do anything it wants. That's, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, they're hung out to dry. The other major minority, the Kurds, the US was very willing to support the Kurds in Syria, Rojava, as long as the Kurds were the foot soldiers for the US effort to drive ISIS out of Syria. The Kurds were the ground forces. They suffered more than 10,000 casualties driving ISIS out of Syria. As soon as that job was done, President Trump kicked them in the face, usual fashion, refused even to allow a small US deterrent force, which would prevent Turkey from the main enemy of the Kurds, prevent Turkey from expanding its invasion of Syria farther into the Kurdish areas. Trump essentially told the Kurds, you did your job. You lost 10,000 people fighting for us. Now I send the Turks to attack you. That's the Kurds. Biden hasn't changed that. So you look at other minorities, about the same. If you don't have power, you're worthless. If you're a powerful state that fits into the overall, or a powerful force which fits into the overall US plan of hegemonic control, then you're fine.
My last question, Professor. In an interview in 2020, you said that it's quite correct to describe the pandemic as a capitalist catastrophe, exacerbated by the neoliberal savagery. Now the world is recovering from the pandemic while we are facing other major risks like global warming. In your opinion, what kind of social impact could a climate catastrophe bring? And is there a possibility to alter the collective language of a society in a way so that that would impose a significant change on the current societal order?
Well, global warming is a far more serious crisis than the pandemic. Pandemic is bad enough. It's already killed more people in the United States than the terrible flu epidemic a century ago. This is completely needless. It would have been perfectly possible to save these lives with proper policies. We know that simply by looking at the countries which did impose the kinds of policies that health workers all over the world have advocated. Asia, Oceania, a few other countries have it pretty much under control. The United States didn't follow those policies, so it's a hotspot, global hotspot. But it's undoubtedly serious. The most serious part of the global pandemic is probably coming. We don't know for sure, but the rich countries, and here I should say Europe has taken a worse role than the United States, but the rich countries have been monopolizing the vaccines for themselves and insisting on preserving the exorbitant profits of the pharmaceutical corporations, which are granted to them by the highly protectionist rules of the so-called free trade agreements, which are not free trade agreements at all. They're highly protectionist. Europe, especially Germany, has been insisting that those exorbitant profits be maintained and that the drug companies be protected from any access to their quite illegitimate patents. The United States has been a little better on this, not enough. But the effect is that huge numbers of people in Africa, Asia, Latin America are not getting vaccinated. Well, we know what that means. It means very likely that a great number of them will die, and furthermore, that everyone's aware it means the virus has a field in which it can mutate, and the mutations might turn out to be truly lethal, maybe even beyond the control of vaccines. That'll feed back to the rich countries, just as the Delta variant has. So the rich countries are, out of pure greed, are accepting the moral opprobrium, should be moral opprobrium, of killing lots of people and also acting to harm themselves. Well, they're also doing the same on global warming, much more severe matter. So take global warming. August 9th, the IPCC issued its latest report, UN international group of scientists, much more dire than any other ones.
Yes.
They were bad enough before. This one made it very explicit that we have to start right now reducing fossil fuel use steadily, year by year, until we essentially phase out fossil fuels roughly by mid-century. He said, unless we do that, we're heading to cataclysm. That's the IPCC report. Now turn to the business press today, yesterday, today's Financial Times, yesterday's Wall Street Journal, other business journals. Take a look at the headlines. The headlines are that the Western countries, United States in the lead, are pressuring the oil producers to increase production. Okay? IPCC says, unless you start reducing production immediately, you're heading to cataclysm. The rich countries are saying, increase production right now, because we want the oil price to go down for our benefit. I mean, if an observer from outer space were watching us, they think we're clinically insane. That's the climate crisis. Well, it's not a matter of language. It's a matter of the social order, how power is distributed, and the driving force in determining how leaders act, which is not the interests of the public. That's not their concern. It's their own power, profit for the major corporations that fund them. Take the United States, which is in the lead on this. There is, as you know, a major conflict going on right now in Congress about what's called the Reconciliation Bill, a bill which tries to reverse slightly the very damaging effect of the neoliberal assault of the last 40 years, tries to provide Americans with some of what is taken for granted in Europe, like child care, for example. Well, the Republicans, the radical party, are 100% opposed. It also includes climate policies to try to mitigate slightly the damage caused by fossil fuel production. Republicans, of course, are 100% opposed. They will not permit anything that is of benefit to the American population because they want to blame the Democrats on whatever goes wrong so they can come back to power. Very explicit. Well, the Senate is split. So the Democrats can only push something through if they're unified. The Democrat, who happens to be the head of the Senate Energy Committee, very influential position, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, he's opposed to the policies. He will not permit policies that reduce the use of fossil fuels, not because of his constituents, not at all. He happens to be the largest recipient of fossil fuel funding in all of Congress. And that's saying a lot because the fossil fuel companies pour money into Congress to buy the representatives. Manchin's the champion. He receives more than anyone. He's following basically the orders of the fossil fuel companies. His position, as he's made clear, is you can't touch fossil fuel production, natural gas, just got to expand it, no constraints. And he said, no elimination, only innovation. That's straight out of the ExxonMobil playbook. You can do what you like as long as you don't eliminate fossil fuels. Well, that's the most powerful country in world history. Europe, not different. European leaders are also pressing the OPEC countries and Russia to increase oil production when they all know perfectly well that that's a call for basically species suicide. Well, that says something about what kind of a species we are.
Professor, thank you very much for your time to talk to us. It was really brilliant, and I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much.